a 45 caliber round enters the back of a man's skull in a log-walled saloon in the Black Hills. His hand drops to the table, two black aces, two black eights, and scatters across the felt like something final. The most famous poker hand in American history, and it belongs to a dead man. August 2nd, 1876. Saloon number 10, Deadwood, Dakota Territory. The most feared gunfighter on the American frontier is sitting with his back to the door, and a drifter named Jack McCall has just done what 100 armed men could not. Wild Bill Hickok is dead. His real name was James Butler Hickok, and he was born in 1837 in Homer, Illinois, a small farming town that would later rename itself Troy Grove. He was raised on a homestead that doubled as a station on the Underground Railroad, and by the time he was 18, he had left it behind, heading west into Kansas Territory to work as a teamster and a stagecoach driver along the frontier that would make him. The Civil War found him early. He served the Union as a scout, a courier, and by most credible accounts, a spy, slipping behind Confederate lines in Missouri and Arkansas to gather intelligence for federal commanders. The war taught him to shoot with precision, to read a room before he entered it, and to kill without hesitating when the situation collapsed. It also gave him the name. Wild Bill attached itself to him during the war years. The precise origin is contested, but by 1865 it was the only name that mattered. And then, in the summer of that year, he did the thing that turned a wartime scout into an American legend. On July 21st, 1865, in the public square of Springfield, Missouri, James Butler Hickok faced a man named Davis Tutt across 75 yards of open ground. The dispute was over a pocket watch. Tutt had taken it over a gambling debt, and Hickok had warned him not to wear it in public. Tutt wore it anyway. They drew at the same moment. Hickok fired a single shot. Tutt fell dead in the street. It was among the earliest documented one-on-one gunfights in the American West, and Wild Bill Hickok walked away from it with a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life, and well beyond it. The weapons that built that reputation deserve a moment of their own. Hickok carried a matched pair of Colt 1851 Navy revolvers, 36 caliber, cap and ball, with ivory grips that gleamed against dark leather, and became as recognizable as the man who held them. He wore them butt forward in a belt or sash, positioned for what was called a cavalry draw, both arms crossing the body, both pistols pulled free in a single fluid motion. It was a method that favored speed and close-quarters instinct, and in Hickok's hands it was devastating. By the late 1860s, the reputation had become a career. He was appointed acting sheriff of Ellis County, Kansas, based in Hays City, in 1869, a rail town full of soldiers, drifters, and men who had come west to disappear. He killed at least 2 men during his time there and kept the peace by making the alternative to peace very clear. In 1871, he was appointed Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, the northern terminus of the Chisholm Trail, where Texas cattle drives collided with Kansas railroad money, and the result was entirely predictable. His months in Abilene were defined by a single terrible night. During a street confrontation in October, Hickok shot and killed a saloon owner named Phil Coe, and in the chaos wheeled and fired again, killing his own deputy, Mike Williams, who had come running to help. He never fully recovered from that. He was relieved of his post before the year was out. Between the gunfights, there was the stage. Hickok toured briefly with his friend William Frederick Buffalo Bill Cody in a theatrical production called Scouts of the Prairie, one of the earliest Wild West shows. He was, by all accounts, miserable in it. He was not a performer. He was the man the performers were based on, and the difference mattered to him. There is a photograph of him from this era that every student of the West has seen. Hair past his shoulders, mustache carefully groomed, a fringed buckskin coat, 2 revolvers visible at his waist. It is one of the most reproduced images of the American frontier. The man in that photograph looks as though the camera was invented for him. He was also, by the mid-1870s, going blind. The condition, as best modern historians can reconstruct it, was likely glaucoma or ophthalmia, a progressive deterioration that had been worsening for years. The man who had dropped Davis Tutt at 75 yards could no longer trust his own eyes. He had tried every remedy available to frontier medicine. None of it held. The most feared gun hand on the continent was losing the one faculty the gun depended on. On March 5, 1876, he married Agnes Thatcher Lake, a circus proprietor and a widow he had first met years earlier in Abilene. It was a brief happiness. Within weeks, he had left her behind and pointed himself toward the Black Hills. The gold rush at Deadwood Gulch was the newest fever dream of the American West. The town sat in a narrow canyon cut through the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, land that belonged by federal treaty to the Lakota Sioux and that had been overrun by prospectors the moment gold was confirmed. Deadwood in the summer of 1876 was not a town in any legal sense. It was a muddy, treeless scar in a mountain gulch, packed with miners, gamblers, gunmen, and men who had come to separate the first group from their dust. Hickok arrived in late June or early July, traveling with a party that included Charlie Utter. He was not there to prospect. He was there because the frontier was narrowing, and Deadwood was one of the last places that still looked like the country he understood. His law days were behind him. The stage was behind him. His eyesight was failing, and he knew it. He told more than one friend that he had a feeling he would never leave Deadwood alive. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1876, Hickok walked into Saloon No. 10, a rough-timbered drinking house, owned in part by Carl Mann. A poker game was already in progress. At the table sat Charlie Rich, Carl Mann, and Captain William Massey, a former Missouri River pilot. Hickok had a rule. He had carried it with him for years, and the men who knew him understood it was not a thing he bent on. He sat with his back to the wall. Always. It was the discipline of a man who had made enough enemies to fill a graveyard, and who understood with the certainty of long experience that the bullet you never see is the one that kills you. That afternoon, the only open seat at the table put his back to the front door. He asked Charlie Rich to trade places. Rich laughed it off, or simply refused. The accounts differ on the tone. They agree on the result. Wild Bill Hickok, who had lived by that single rule for over a decade, sat down in the wrong chair. Jack McCall was a drifter and a small-time gambler with no reputation worth recording, and nothing that history would remember him for, except for what he did next. Sometime in the mid-afternoon, McCall walked into Saloon No. 10, moved behind Hickok's chair, drew a pistol, and fired a single round into the back of Wild Bill's head. The ball passed through and struck Captain William Massey in the wrist. Hickok pitched forward and was dead before his hand left the table. The cards spilled across the felt, 2 black aces, 2 black eights. The 5th card has never been confirmed. McCall shouted that Hickok had killed his brother, and a claim that was almost certainly untrue. He ran from the saloon. He was caught within the hour. There was no legal court in Deadwood in the summer of 1876. The camp sat on unceded treaty land, outside any recognized jurisdiction. A miners' court was assembled, a jury of prospectors, bartenders, and fortune seekers. And Jack McCall was tried the following day. He was acquitted. The verdict held only as long as it took the federal government to notice. Because Deadwood had no legal standing to try a murder case, the acquittal was void. McCall was rearrested, tried in a federal court at Yankton, Dakota Territory, convicted of murder, and hanged on March 1, 1877. He died for a killing he had already walked away from once in a courtroom that existed because the first one did not count. The hand, 2 black aces, 2 black eights, became the dead man's hand. Within a generation, it had entered the permanent vocabulary of American folklore. Poker players know it the way sailors know the albatross. It has appeared in more novels, films, and songs than any other combination of cards ever dealt. But the hand is not the story. The story is a man who understood exactly one thing about survival. Never let anyone stand behind you. And who, on a single August afternoon, broke his own rule because the only open seat was the wrong one and a friend would not trade. Wild Bill Hickok survived the Civil War. He survived Hays City and Abilene. He survived Davis Tutt at 75 yards and a decade of frontier violence that buried most of the men who lived it. He did not survive a card game. There is something in that. Not irony exactly, but something very close. The thing that killed him was not a faster hand or a better marksman. It was a chair. An ordinary failure of luck, in a life that had run on luck for years. His eyes were going. His best years were behind him. The frontier he had helped build was already being overtaken by railroads and courtrooms, and the kind of law that no longer needed a man with 2 revolvers to enforce it. He was 39 years old, and the West he knew was closing around him. Maybe Deadwood was always going to be the last stop. Maybe the premonition was just a man who could read odds looking at his own. But the chair, that is the detail you cannot get past. He knew better. He asked. He was told no. And he sat down anyway. Chambered in history.